This baby floats happily in water and has done so since birth. She is part of the success story of human evolution. We like water. We like to live beside it and to look at it. We play in it, we baptize in it, and some babies now are even born in water. There is a theory about why this is so. This is the story about one man's idea and its struggle for acceptance. As we rush towards an uncertain future, we leave behind an equally uncertain past. Wired into the latest in high technology, it's easy to forget who we are. Homo sapiens, by our own definition, the wisest of the great apes. An ape that can fly at twice the speed of sound, but an ape just the same. 20 years ago, the zoologist Desmond Morris reminded the nuclear generation of our place in the natural world. There are 193 living species of monkey and apes. 192 of them are covered in hair. We are the naked ape.
People who have a kind of fundamentalist religious approach still claim that you can't show any continuity between the human species and other animal species. This is, of course, nonsensical. We have many different ancestral forms going back not 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, but now 4, even 5 million years, and we're tracing it further and further back. Then there's a jump of about 5 million years back to somewhere around 8, 9, 10, 11 million years, when we find very, very remote sort of monkey ancestors. And that gap between 5 and 10 million years, very roughly, is a bit of a mystery. We don't know what happened then.
In this gap lies the mystery of our origins. But the message in the genetic code, the DNA, is quite clear. Although our split from the ancestor of the chimp and the gorilla occurred 5 or 6 million years ago, the blueprint for human creation remains 99% the same as theirs. Only 1% of body and mind organization sets us apart from the jungle. The great puzzle is, why, if we are so much the same, are we so different? What sparked us off on the path towards hunting and meat-eating, towards using tools and losing hair, towards a big brain and standing upright? It could be that entering the water was the original springboard that launched us on our climb up the evolutionary ladder. This isn't as strange as it may seem. All sorts of land mammals have adjusted to the water. 70 million years ago, ancestors of the whales and dolphins answered the call of the ocean. 50 million years ago, it was the turn of a hoofed creature related to the elephant. Their descendants are the sirenians, the dugong and the manatee, that are vegetarian and feed on seaweed. Then, bear-like carnivorous mammals waded in. They became fur seals, sea lions, and walruses. The true seal came from another carnivore, thought to resemble a dog. Besides these, aquatic birds, marsupials, rodents, reptiles, and the monotreme platypus have all done the same. All are descended from land animals. It has now been suggested that for 1 million years or more, our ancestors may have spent much of their day living in the sea. Here they lost their hair, learned to stand upright, began to eat shellfish, and became the dexterous, curious individuals we are today. This strange idea has become known as the aquatic ape theory. It was the brainchild of a young marine biologist, Alister Hardy. Now 88 years old, Sir Alister can look back on a distinguished career. But in 1927, he was like any other Oxford graduate, with his heart set on an academic life. He had just spent 2 years in the South Polar Seas. But then he happened to read a book by Professor Wood Jones called Man's Place Among the Mammals.
And when I read Wood Jones, I was absolutely surprised. Surprised that he hadn't seen the answer that I could see so well.
And he dragged the book off the shelf and he opened it up and he showed it to me. And it was a book in which there was a sentence which said that anatomists do not understand why human beings have a layer of adipose fat. That's why our skin, in other words, is, as it were, fixed onto a layer of fat. If you look at a cat or a dog, you can actually pull the skin like this. But our skin is fixed to this fat layer. Now, it's a layer of fat which is really like blubber. And Alister Hardy, as a marine biologist, had noticed that all aquatic mammals that go back into the sea again develop a layer of blubber. And he said to himself, why on earth should the human species have a layer of blubber? Unless perhaps it went through an aquatic phase in its very, very early days.
All marine mammals have this layer of subcutaneous fat. It helps with streamlining, it stores energy, and it keeps them warm. We have it as well, to a lesser extent, but we are the only primates that do. It's most noticeable in babies, where it insulates and provides buoyancy. When we put on weight, we get fat fingers and fat cheeks, as well as fat stomachs. Monkeys don't. A human baby looks chubby alongside a chimpanzee.
Why Jones didn't see it, I cannot think. But to me, as soon as I read his words, it rang his bell, and I felt I knew the answer. Well, that was nearly 60 years ago. It seemed so preposterous, though. I kept it dark. I didn't feel that I should announce it yet, but I went on accumulating facts.
He was right to be cautious. The story of the human race had for thousands of years been bound up in myths and religious dogma. The biblical account allowed no room for argument. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word said that man was created in God's image. Heaven help anyone with other ideas. Then came Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace to suggest that we were a specialized form of primate. They pricked Victorian sensibilities in a way that caused a storm with the church. Darwin was lampooned and ridiculed. But he also struck a responsive chord that said, this must be right. Natural selection makes sense. In time, the origin of the species begat the descent of man as surely as Abraham begat Isaac, and evolution became the word. The aquatic ape theory is the biggest new idea in the story of our development since Darwin. Like Darwin, Hardy was reluctant to publish his idea, and for 30 years he remained silent. Nothing he learned in that time proved him wrong. But in those years, our view of the Earth as a stable environment has changed completely. We now know it is a volatile planet. Continental plates are colliding. Mountain ranges are growing. There have been 7 ice ages in the last 2 million years, and no one knows if the sequence is finished. Nothing brings evolutionary change as quickly as changes in climate. And this was an important clue. What was the climate doing between 5 and 10 million years ago when there is this gap in the human story? We were in the grip of the Pliocene drought. The Pliocene drought lasted 12 million years. It destroyed the great forests of Africa, and whole species of animals died. It also created the savanna, the great open grasslands that brought the golden age of the grazing animals and the predators who lived off them. As forests dwindled, weaker primates were forced out onto the savanna. There was little food and no protection. It is now widely believed that here, on the African savanna, our ancestors stood upright, lost their hair, and changed the whole pattern of their lives simply in order to survive. This is known as the savanna theory.
And this would be the orthodox story. It is possible to construct a perfectly good ancestral tale going back, telling this tale step by step as a gradual change from a fruit and nut-eating monkey to a weapon-carrying, predatory, carnivorous ape.
Remember, though, that whatever happened to us 5 million years ago cannot have happened to the ancestors of the gorillas and chimpanzees, who have changed in less remarkable ways. Many zoologists believe there is another way we could have achieved these changes in physiology. Newborn apes have rounder heads, more upright posture, and are generally more human in their proportion than adult apes. There is a mechanism in nature called neoteny, which lets an animal retain its baby features into adulthood.
Changes such as the loss of fur and shift of body posture into a more bipedal position with the head in this position instead of in that position and so on. All these changes were as a result of this neotenous process. Okay, that's fine, but it doesn't give us any reason as to why we needed that change at a particular point in our evolution. Something had to push us that way, and we don't know what it was.
Alister Hardy felt he had discovered the answer. The idea seemed so clear to him, but he knew it would rock the academic establishment and could be used to discredit him.
And I wanted to get a good professorship. I wanted to become a fellow of the Royal Society. I couldn't do that, holding the aquatic ape theory. And so, quite candidly, I kept smothered up. There came a time when I was invited to be guest speaker at a dinner of an international conference organised by the British Sub-Aqua Association at Brighton. And so I thought, well, now, it doesn't matter. The Brighton Argus may report it, but that'll be all. Now, the awful thing was that this was a Friday night. Now, on Sunday, almost every Sunday newspaper carried great banner headlines. Oxford professor says man a sea ape. And then the most appalling rubbish follows. And I thought, oh, Lord, I daren't go back to Oxford now.
One of his oldest friends, a famous comparative anatomist, rang him up on the telephone and said, Alister, think of your reputation. You can't put out such a wild idea. But the marvelous thing about Alister Hardy is that he is a scientist with imagination. He is not a coward, as I'm afraid some academic scientists have become. You see, it's a very fine line between academic caution, proper academic caution, and craven academic cowardice.
The aquatic ape theory had now gained a momentum of its own and was rippling outwards way beyond the walls of Oxford. It washed over a coal mining village in South Wales, where another Oxford graduate lives. Elaine Morgan is a writer and a dramatist. Her interest in evolutionary theory had been provoked by a sense of outrage. According to Genesis, God first created man, and woman was not only an afterthought, but an amenity. The accepted Tarzan scenarios spoke of primitive man, the mighty hunter, and nowhere did the female of the species play any significant role. In 1972, Elaine Morgan wrote a controversial and at times humorous account of human evolution from the female perspective, and in it she brought the aquatic ape theory to the public's attention.
There are two things that scientists don't like. They don't like feminism or any kind of politics creeping into science, and above all, they don't like humor creeping into it. So, although everyone said this is a jolly good read and very interesting and thought-provoking, nobody analysed it seriously or said yes or no, we believe it or we don't believe it.
After 10 years' silence from the scientific community, Morgan published a concise account of the aquatic ape theory. In a science that is wreathed in foggy supposition, it makes a very clear statement. People could now picture the details of this edge-of-the-sea existence.
Once you're on any kind of coastline, the sea is a very rich source of food. I think they might have begun, as Alister Hardy suggested, they might have begun with shellfish, and this might have been the first tool. If you try to search for it, you can't recognize it as a tool. It's the same as all the other pebbles. But they could have used it to crack open shellfish, as in fact the sea otters still do.
The Californian sea otter is the closest living example of the way Hardy imagined the aquatic ape gathered its food. It lives off sea urchins and other shellfish like small clams, and it uses stones to break open their shells. It happily dives to gather both food and rocks. Like the seal, it keeps its fur because the water is cool. But for aquatic apes, the sea would have been much warmer. During the Pliocene, there were no polar ice caps, and the sea was more like a warm bath.
If there were cliffs, they would have been very well adapted to climb because they were used to climbing trees and they were good at handholds. Coming out of the sea would be things like the dugong. Once they're ashore, they're totally helpless. It's not like a leopard. You don't have to be afraid it's going to fight back. You simply have to bonk it on the head and eat it. And another source of food would be turtles. They will come out of the sea. You turn them on their backs and they're helpless. You soon learn to get them eat. And as opposed to some of the things that they were beating on the land, it's an all-year-round source of food. If they came to places where there were cliffs, they would be able to climb cliffs and get seabirds' eggs. I think that probably they were about aquatic to the same degree as an otter, so that they would spend large amounts of time in the water, but come ashore to sleep and to breed. Nothing that went back into the sea was the least well adapted to it in the beginning, and in all cases it must have been a dangerous environment and taken a long time to adapt. But it happened. It has happened over and over again. In fact, the primates are said to be the only creatures that haven't got an aquatic member. I think that they do have an aquatic member, and it's ourselves.
Not all scientists are as enchanted with the aquatic ape theory as Elaine Morgan. Science journalist and author of a book on human evolution, Jeremy Cherfas.
I mean, all animals have fat pads, and it could have been a response to cold, not in the water, but on land. I mean, there's nothing unique about subcutaneous fat and aquatic animals. There are plenty of terrestrial animals that have subcutaneous fat.
Not hairless ones.
Not hairless ones, no, I agree. There are some mysteries around. I don't know why we lost our hair.
A closer look at the land animals that do have this fat layer, like elephants and hippos, reveals that most of them spend time in the water and, like us, have lost their hair. The association of water with hairlessness is the essence of Hardy's idea. The savanna explanation for our loss of hair is quite different.
When we became hunters, we could have evolved that adipose fat in a quite different way. For example, supposing you imagine us suddenly changing to hunters who have to chase. Hot, it's hot, and we're chasing and running like athletes today, and we're chasing after these prey to catch them instead of just picking fruits like this. Now, we'd overheat very rapidly. If we take off our coats to avoid overheating, what we have is now a naked skin, but it could leave us rather cold at night when we're not hunting. The only way in which you can keep yourself warm is to use a layer of fat. And as you know, fat people keep warm better than thin people.
Losing our hair, then developing a layer of fat to keep warm, and sweat glands to keep cool, seems an absurdly complicated biological process, and it raises all sorts of questions. Why has no other hunting animal adopted this elaborate method of temperature control? Baboons moved from the trees out onto the grassland, as we are supposed to have done. They are also good runners. Why aren't they hairless too? Most importantly of all, if it was man, the hunter, who was becoming overheated, why did the slower-moving female, spending all her day gathering food, lose even more hair? Most zoologists have chosen to ignore these questions Elaine Morgan raised, as they have chosen to ignore the aquatic ape theory. Among the few to take it seriously is the anthropologist and marine biologist Lyle Watson.
All we have left is a fine layer of down on our skins. But if you look at this closely, it's fascinating because it forms flow lines, patterns, which are exactly those patterns that a body would have needed if it were to be streamlined underwater.
The hairlessness is not a question of not having hair. If you take an area of skin and look at it under the microscope and count the number of hair follicles, we have exactly the same density of hair follicles as the chimpanzee and the gorilla. What we haven't got are the hairs.
Well, if you counted the hairs on Queen Victoria's face and Darwin's face, they would be exactly the same, but it doesn't mean to say that Darwin didn't have a beard and was different in this respect than Queen Victoria.
In biology, we're trapped often into thinking that everything has an adaptive reason, that there is a purpose in evolutionary terms for everything. And we've been trapped, I think, into asking why it is that we are hairless. It may be that there is no damn good reason.
They say, well, it may be true, but it doesn't need an explanation. Not everything in biology can be explained in that way, and so we prefer not to talk about it and not think about it. And I think this is a counsel of despair and shows that they are on the ropes.
When they first hear the aquatic ape theory, many people instinctively reject it because water spells danger. And lots of people not only can't swim, they don't want to learn. It seems a very unsafe place, especially for babies. Apes, it's true, don't like water, but there are monkeys like the crab-eating macaques and the proboscis that do. Proboscis monkeys live in the mangrove swamps of Borneo. They are extremely shy, but have been known to swim rivers to get to new clumps of mangroves, and have even been found 2 miles out into the China Sea. They are surprisingly at home in these warm tropical waters. And then there is one peculiar species of ape that likes to spend its holidays at the seaside and comes alive down the tube of a 10-foot wave. When we're not in the sea, we take our daily baptism in the bath or the shower. Of all our physical features that help us in water, none is more intriguing than the diving reflex.
When submerged, the physiology automatically begins to act in a way which reduces oxygen consumption. Now, this is an adaptation which is obviously useful to seals and sea lions, the only other mammals we know, apart from the whales and dolphins, that have such a reflex. And the assumption must be that we should have gone through a stage in our evolution where it would have been equally useful to us.
In 1976, Jacques Mayol set the record for the deepest human dive on one breath. Off the coast of Elba, he plunged over 260 feet and was underwater for 3.5 minutes. During this time, the diving reflex caused his heart rate to drop to 30 beats per minute. The diving reflex is most noticeable in babies up to the age of 18 months. Igor Tchaikovsky, a Russian scientist, has become world famous for his experiments with water birthing and for being one of the first to recognize the potential of young babies in water. His own daughter, Vita, was born 20 years ago. She was premature and physically weak. She weighed a little over 2.5 pounds, and the doctors gave up hope of saving her. In desperation, Tchaikovsky asked if he could take her home. Straight away, he put her into water that was 93 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the start of something amazing. Look at these babies. They learn to swim before they can crawl, and are perfectly happy in water. Even distressed babies find warm water calming and reassuring. Tchaikovsky has found that babies stimulated in this way develop into stronger, more alert and confident children.
Some people find it hard to conceive that they could have lived for long hours of every day in the sea. But this does happen. I mean, with modern people or recent people, not only in tropical areas, but in places like Tierra del Fuego.
Hardy and Morgan suggest that while we were in the water, we would have stopped relying on visual signals and smell for communication. Like whales and dolphins, we would have learnt to use our voices, because water carries sound much better than air. All monkeys and apes have lungs and larynxes, but they don't have the capacity for speech that we have, for one good reason: they don't have breath control. If when we learned to swim, we developed control over our breathing, this in turn would have made speech possible. We cry salty tears, another feature we share with marine birds and mammals, and which other apes and monkeys don't have. But there is one distinctly human feature staring us right in the face, for which neither the savanna theorists nor the neotonists have a convincing story: the nose. In all other apes and monkeys, the nostrils point outwards or to the side. Ours point downwards. The spine of cartilage strengthening our nose clearly has a purpose.
This would have deflected the water and stopped it being forced up into the nostrils. The only other primate extinct or extant which has got a spine of this kind was Oreopithecus, and that's known as the swamp ape, so that must have been in water too. And of course the proboscis monkey is a good swimmer, and that's got a covering over its nose as well.
Yes, maybe. I'm a little skeptical about this for one reason, that if I were designing an aquatic ape, the first thing I would do is I would give it valvular nostrils, that is, nostrils that open and shut. And we don't have that. It makes sense because, I mean, you've only got to look at a seal or a sea lion or any aquatic animal, hippopotamus, and you watch them come up And the first thing they do is they open like this, and the nostrils open and then close again. It is possible that we had it and then lost it, and it may be that the flaring of the nostrils, sort of, you know, I can't do it now. Flaring of the nostrils is a sort of movement that is a kind of remnant of what happened in the ancient past. Now that readaptation to life on land would have started to wear down those aquatic features, to reduce the aquatic features that we had acquired. So that what we're seeing today, I mean, he talks about this piece of skin here on the hand as a remnant of webbing of the hand. And indeed, our hands are better for swimming because they're flattened than the hands of apes and monkeys. Now, that might be a remnant, but back in our real aquatic days, you see, we might have had webbing all the way around here. Now, that wouldn't show up on fossils, but other bone changes might.
Many other physical differences separate us from all other apes. Hardy and Morgan claim that the aquatic ape theory explains these differences better than the savanna or the neoteny theories. But to make any kind of judgment, one has to appreciate how little evidence there is for all our ideas of human evolution.
If we were to gather all the material on early human remains from everywhere on Earth and bring it together in one place, it would scarcely fill a single coffin. There'd be room to spare.
Savanna or aquatic? The one thing everyone does agree on is that the answer to our origins lies buried somewhere in the African continent.
The Great Rift Valley is a wonderful dramatic feature, perhaps the most dramatic on the whole Earth's surface. It's a natural corridor that runs from Turkey through the Red Sea all the way down through East Africa, down to Southern Africa. It's a good place to look for fossils because there's volcanic activity here, and ash which preserves things well. But I think the reason we're finding things there now is not so much prehistoric as historic. It goes back to two people, to Louis Leakey, who lived and worked in Nairobi, and naturally started looking in his own backyard on the edge of the Great Rift Valley there, and to Raymond Dart, who lived at the southern end of the valley in South Africa and found his first find there. There hasn't even been a superficial surface survey of the central area and the gap between the northern and southern finds.
Surprisingly, the chances of finding fossils are not as hopeless as one might think. Each year produces some new piece to fill in a tiny part of the picture. From small scraps of bone evidence, paleoanthropologists can piece together portraits to hang in the ancestral gallery. But the gaps are still huge. The missing link is more like a missing chain, stretching back longer than the period for which we have human fossils. Who can say where the line of hominoid apes ends and the hominid human ancestors begin? What fossils are there for the period crucial to the aquatic ape theory? Professor of Paleoanthropology at Harvard University, David Pilbeam.
Well, between 3 and 3/4 million years ago, when the hominid fossil record starts to become really quite good, and 14 million years ago, which is when the hominoid fossil record in Africa ceases to be quite good, we have just a few bits and pieces, less than half a dozen scraps. Here's a couple of them. This is a single isolated tooth from Kenya that's around 6 million years old. This little piece of lower jaw was just found this season by our expeditions in Kenya. This is around 5 million years old. Here's an earlier piece of jaw found by another Harvard expedition some time ago that's somewhere between 3 and 5 million years old. And essentially that's it. That's the sum total of the hominid fossil evidence.
You have to find fossils, but it is no good saying we can't discuss the theory until we find the fossils, because there are no fossils of any kind covering that area. And this was one of the first things that suggested to Alister Hardy, where did they go? They suddenly disappeared from the face of the earth, and when they came back, they were different. They were hominids.
The sea otter has two land cousins, the stoat and the polecat. Their skeletons look almost identical, but in one area, the pelvis, there is a difference. The pelvis of the sea otter has turned. Its hind legs and its spine are now in a straight line, allowing it a more streamlined shape. This vital change brought one painful drawback for the female sea otter. Like monkeys and most land mammals, both stoats and polecats mate from behind. The male sinks his teeth into the fur on the back of the female's neck and holds on, sometimes for as long as 15 minutes. But like most marine mammals, sea otters mate in the water. And when their pelvic girdle turned, their sex organs turned as well. Like whales and dolphins, sea otters can only mate belly to belly. In itself, this didn't matter, but the male's sex drive still tells him to hang on. Instead of biting her neck, he now bites her snout. And in the mating season, the females can be easily spotted, their noses covered in blood. How could a body that was comfortably right-angled at the hips pull itself up into a straight line? Alister Hardy believes we needed the support of the sea to do it. This turning of the pelvis was the turning point in our evolution. It made us more streamlined. And as with the sea otter, mating from the rear was no longer the most desirable approach. We preferred belly to belly. Water provided not just the buoyancy that allowed us to stand upright, it provided the motivation. We needed to keep our heads up. Just as Hardy was convinced by features he could see in today's marine mammals, it may be that for much of the evidence, we don't have to look beyond ourselves, the human race. Spot the vital difference, apart from the running shorts and shoes, that is. Bipedalism, getting along on 2 legs instead of 4, gave us our real head start on all the other apes. It wasn't any quicker, it was a lot less stable and probably less efficient, but it meant that our hands were free to carry, our fingers free to grip, and new horizons stimulated our imagination. But how do the traditional theories explain bipedalism?
Well, there have been probably dozens of explanations for why we became bipedal. That we became bipedal in order to facilitate tool use, that we became bipedal to see further, that we became bipedal to bluff other animals, we became bipedal to carry objects, sometimes food, sometimes babies, sometimes tools. My own somewhat favoured notion is that it's food and feeding that is the direction to look.
If you were quadrupedal ape like a chimpanzee, there's no reason why you wouldn't walk along on 3 legs and drag it with your other hand. It's much quicker. You have to have a very powerful incentive to stand on 2 legs and walk. It's only happened to one mammal in the whole of evolution. There must be a very special reason.
With plenty of observation but no fossil evidence, what will become of the aquatic ape theory? It's like an imaginative but difficult child which the grown-ups of human prehistory wish would go away.
I have the greatest respect for the scientific method. I can understand why they won't take seriously theories that involve facts that you can't check or supernatural intervention. But the aquatic theory is based on strict neo-Darwinian principles. All the facts are known and verifiable.
But I don't think they lived in the water. They drank it, they used it perhaps even for washing, but they didn't live in it. And what Sir Alister and Elaine Morgan would have us believe is that they lived in the water. That's the bit I can't accept, and that's the bit I think we will never have evidence for.
But I do believe that since there is a mysterious gap between 5 and 10 million years ago in our ancestry, and since we do have a number of very strange anatomical features that can very well be explained by an aquatic phase, that we must keep an open mind about it. And it would be a tragedy if closed and narrow minds rejected it so forcibly that the aquatic theory just disappeared forever before someone had set out to find some hard evidence.
I think that as we find the links in the missing chain, we're going to fill it in with a story that is more conventional than the aquatic ape story. But that shouldn't prevent us from looking hard in those places, in those kinds of sediments where you would expect to find fossils if the aquatic ape theory were true, namely fossil sediments that were near shore or fossil sediments that were in lakes.
Because if there is and was an aquatic ape, he would have been on the shores of the Pliocene Sea. He would have been somewhere down here. 10 million years ago, the coastline of Africa would have been very different. The sea level has dropped since then. It was about 600 or 700 feet higher at that time, which means that the ocean line would have been roughly up here on the edge of the present escarpment, and all of the coastal plains, which you see here in green, would have been flooded. If 10 million years ago we did live on the coast, and if 3 or 4 million years ago we were living in the Rift Valley in the interior, somewhere between those two times we had to move from the coast into the middle. And I think we would have done that along clearly defined avenues. It's very difficult to climb the escarpment anywhere along here, but there are a few places where river valleys cut straight through and actually join up with the Great Rift. And there's only one area where that happens really easily, and that's here, where the present Zambezi flows down into the sea. So what I'm suggesting is that if we are to find Pliocene fossils, and we look on the coastline in an area where I think aquatic ancestors may well once have lived, that the best place to look is here on the southern end of the Rift Valley, on the borders of Malawi and Mozambique. I predict that's where we're going to find our aquatic apes.
With the sea much higher during this period, many parts of North Africa were underwater. Today's mountains would have been islands whose dwindling forests presented all the conditions and inducements needed for an aquatic ape. The Danakil Mountains in Ethiopia lie at the junction of the African and Eurasian continents and are next to the great fossil beds of the Rift Valley. They are now considered to be the most likely alternate area for exploration. Whether there was one large island where this species evolved in isolation, or whether they island hopped like the proboscis monkey in Borneo, we can't tell. We do know that just after the relevant period, the sea level began dropping and the Danakil Mountains rejoined the African continent. We had gone from the land to the sea and then back again. And from that point on, the story of human evolution would have continued along conventional lines. The aquatic phase was the trigger of change. Neoteny was the mechanism of change. The savanna was the domain the aquatic apes returned to conquer. Whether we are in the process of readapting to the land or not, Alister Hardy has reminded us of one simple principle of life. Every living organism goes on evolving and changing. Maybe these macaques are taking the first steps along a path we took 5 million years ago. Another 5 million years may see them talking and flying through the skies. And where will we be? Within a lifetime, the first space colonies will be born, and we can determine the gravity we live in. When mammals went back into the sea and became weightless, they grew bigger. Water babies are showing what happens when the pull of gravity is released. Physiologically, we face challenges as dramatic as those our ape ancestors faced all those millions of years ago. Hardy has shown how exciting these ideas can be.
Now, to me, speculation is the very fuel of scientific progress, provided it is followed up by careful experiment or observation to try and confirm it.
Alister Hardy has spent his life imagining, experimenting, and observing. His dream now is that he will live to see new fossil evidence that will either prove or disprove the aquatic ape theory. Some ideas die with those who inspired them, Others take on a life of their own and change the way we see ourselves. Dr. Jacob Bronowski observed that there are many gifts that are unique in mankind, but at the center of them all, the root from which all knowledge grows, lies the ability to draw conclusions from what we see to what we do not see, to move our minds through space and time, and to recognize ourselves in the past on the steps to the present. Hardy used this ability to a rare degree, and in doing so he might just have found the key that will one day join the links in our evolutionary chain.
Science has not seen water babies and assumes, therefore, that they don't exist. I have not seen water babies, but I'm not making that assumption. I'm leaving the door open because there's something deep inside me that says, that feels right. It makes sense. Water babies work.